1908, family image uncovered. And experts are stunned when they spot what lies between the girls. Dr. James Washington had dedicated his career to preserving black history, but on this particular October afternoon at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, he stumbled upon something that would consume the next year of his life. The museum had recently acquired a collection of early 20th century photographs from an estate in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and James's task was to catalog and research each image for potential exhibition. Most of the photographs were typical of the era, families in their Sunday best, stoic expressions, the formality that early cameras demanded. But one image immediately caught his attention and wouldn't let go. The photograph showed a black family of 6, clearly taken around 1908 based on the clothing styles and photographic technique. A woman sat in the center, her posture erect and dignified despite the weight of obvious grief visible in her eyes. 4 daughters surrounded her, 2 standing behind, 2 seated on either side, ranging in age from perhaps 16 down to about 8 years old. Their expressions were serious, determined, their eyes fixed on the camera with an intensity that seemed to burn through time itself. But it was what lay between the 2 youngest girls that made James lean closer, his breath catching in his throat. Positioned carefully on the bench between them, partially obscured by the folds of their dresses, but still clearly visible, was a document. Even in the faded sepia tones of the photograph, James could make out official-looking text, a seal, and what appeared to be a signature. The girls' hands were positioned protectively near it, not touching but clearly guarding, as if the photographer had instructed them to make the document visible while also suggesting its importance. James pulled out his magnifying glass and examined the image more closely. The document appeared to be some kind of legal paper folded once, but open to display its contents. He could make out partial words. Property. Acres. Oklahoma Territory. His heart began to race. This wasn't just a family portrait. This was a statement, a declaration, a piece of evidence deliberately preserved for posterity. The more James studied the photograph, the more details emerged. The mother's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles visible even through the photograph's grain, hands that gripped with tension and determination. The oldest daughter, standing behind her mother's right shoulder, had one hand resting protectively on the woman's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity and support. The second daughter mirrored this on the left side. But the 2 youngest girls, seated on either side of the mysterious document, had positioned their bodies as if creating a protective barrier around it. Their postures were unnaturally stiff, even for an era when photographers routinely instructed subjects to remain motionless. This was intentional positioning, carefully choreographed. James spent the rest of that afternoon trying to trace the photograph's origins. The estate records indicated it had come from the belongings of a woman named Helen Richardson, who had passed away at 98. The consignment notes mentioned that Helen had been a retired attorney who had spent decades working on land rights cases in Oklahoma, and that she had specifically requested this photograph be donated to a museum where its story could finally be told. James made a decision. Whatever story this photograph held, he would uncover it. The determined faces of those girls, the protective positioning of that document, the grief and strength in their mother's eyes, they deserved to have their truth known. The following morning, James contacted the estate executor in Tulsa, a lawyer named Robert Chen who had handled Helen Richardson's affairs. Robert's voice carried a note of relief when James explained his interest in the photograph. "I'm so glad someone is finally looking into this," Robert said. "Miss Richardson talked about that photograph constantly in her final years. She said it represented everything she'd fought for in her legal career. She could never get anyone interested in the story. She made me promise to find it a home where people would care." "Did she tell you anything about the family in the image?" James asked, already taking notes. "Some. The woman in the center was her great-great-grandmother, a woman named Ada. The girls were Ada's daughters. Miss Richardson was the great-granddaughter of the oldest girl in the photo, the one standing in the back left. She said her grandmother had told her stories about that day, about why they took that photograph, and what the document between the girls represented." James felt a surge of excitement. "What was the document?" "A land deed," Robert replied. 160 acres in the all-black town of Liberty, Oklahoma. Miss Richardson said her great-great-grandmother Ada had fought for over 2 decades to keep that land after her husband was murdered for refusing to sell it to white developers. The photograph was taken right after the murder, before the legal battles really intensified. Ada wanted proof, visual evidence that they had the deed, that they had every legal right to that property. James sat back in his chair processing this information. Oklahoma in the early 1900s had been home to dozens of prosperous all-black towns, communities where formerly enslaved people and their descendants had built lives of independence and economic success. But those communities had faced relentless opposition, violence, legal manipulation, and systematic efforts to drive black families from their land. He had read about these towns in his graduate studies, had written papers about the economic and social significance of black land ownership during Reconstruction and its aftermath. But this was different. This was a specific family, a specific story, preserved in an image that had survived more than a century. Robert, I need to know everything. Do you have any other documents from Helen's estate? Letters, legal papers? Anything that might help me piece together the full story? I have boxes, Robert said. Miss Richardson kept everything. Her grandmother's journals, court transcripts, newspaper clippings, even correspondence with lawyers and judges. She was meticulous about documentation. I've been storing it all, waiting for someone who would actually care enough to go through it properly. When can you come to Tulsa? James checked his calendar. I can be there next week. I'll have everything ready for you, Robert promised. Miss Richardson would be so happy to know her family's story is finally going to be told. She spent her whole life fighting to preserve their legacy, and in the end, she worried it would all be forgotten. James hung up the phone and returned to the photograph, studying it with new understanding. This wasn't just a historical artifact. This was a weapon, carefully crafted by a grieving widow who understood that in a world designed to deny her rights, documentation might be her only defense. James flew to Tulsa the following Tuesday, renting a car and driving immediately to Robert's law office in the historic Greenwood district. The neighborhood still bore invisible scars from the 1921 massacre, but it had been rebuilt with determination, a testament to resilience that James found deeply moving as he walked through streets where black businesses once again thrived. Robert had prepared a conference room with boxes of materials carefully organized by decade. I took the liberty of creating a basic timeline, he explained, handing James a folder. Helen was meticulous about dates. This should help you navigate through everything. James opened the first box, labeled 1890, 1910, Ada and Samuel, Liberty Township. Inside were letters, photographs, land documents, and a thick leather journal with Ada Freeman embossed on the cover in fading gold letters. He opened the journal carefully, his hands trembling slightly at the privilege of holding something so personal, so precious. The first entry was dated March 15th, 1891, the handwriting elegant and careful, the work of someone who had learned to write with deliberate effort and took pride in the skill. Samuel and I have claimed our land today, Ada had written. 160 acres of rich Oklahoma soil, ours by right of the Homestead Act. We are among 50 families establishing the town of Liberty, and we have named it well. After generations in bondage, after years of sharecropping on land that would never truly be ours, we finally have something that cannot be taken away. The children, our 4 beautiful girls, will grow up as landowners, as free people with roots and futures. This is what freedom truly means. Not just the absence of chains, but the presence of ownership, of stake, of belonging to a place that belongs to us. James read through entry after entry, watching Ada's hope and determination shine through her words. She described building their home with Samuel, planting their first crops, watching Liberty grow from a collection of tents and temporary shelters into a real town with proper houses, a school, and a church. She wrote about community meetings where families discussed everything from crop rotation to establishing a town council. She documented births, weddings, celebrations of harvest and survival. Liberty had been thriving. Black doctors, teachers, merchants, and farmers, creating a community of prosperity and dignity. Ada's entries from the mid-1890s described a place where her daughters could attend school without fear, where neighbors supported each other, where the future seemed limitless. But the tone of the entries began to change around 1905. Men came today, Ada wrote on July 3rd, 1905. White men from the development company in Tulsa. They said our town sits on land they want for expansion. They offered to buy us out. Their words made it sound generous, as if they were doing us a favor. But their eyes and their manner told the truth. This was not an offer. This was a warning. They expect us to be grateful, to accept whatever pittance they decide our land is worth, to pack up and move on like we have no rights, no claims, no dignity. Samuel told them we would not sell. I watched their faces harden. We have made enemies today. Samuel had refused to sell, as had most of the other families in Liberty. The journal entries from 1906 and 1907 documented escalating harassment, crops destroyed overnight, livestock killed and left to rot in fields, threatening letters left on doorsteps, and violence against families who refused to leave. Then James found the entry from February 14, 1908. His hands shook as he read Ada's words written in script that trembled with grief and rage. They killed my Samuel today, Ada had written, the ink blotted in places where tears had fallen onto the page, smudging words that nevertheless remained brutally clear. Shot him in broad daylight in front of our home, in front of our daughters, because he would not surrender our land. The sheriff says it was a dispute between neighbors, that Samuel drew his weapon first. This is a lie. Samuel was unarmed. He was carrying fence posts to repair the eastern boundary. Our neighbors saw everything. Mrs. Patterson, Mr. Johnson, the Williams family. They all witnessed the murder, but the sheriff will not hear their testimony. He will not arrest the men who did this. We are black, and our words mean nothing in his courtroom." James had to pause, overcome by the raw pain in Ada's words. He could feel the weight of her grief across more than a century, could imagine her sitting at a table in a home that had suddenly become unbearable, forcing herself to document what had happened, because she understood that written testimony might be the only justice available to her. He looked up at Robert, who nodded solemnly. "It gets worse before it gets better," Robert said quietly. "But keep reading. Ada was remarkable." James continued. In the days following Samuel's murder, representatives from the Tulsa Development Company had appeared at Ada's door, offering to help the widow in her time of need by purchasing the land for a fraction of its value. They had presented it as charity, as kindness to a woman left alone with 4 daughters to raise. Ada had refused. She documented their response in her journal. "When I told them no, their pretense of sympathy vanished," she wrote. "And they said I should think of my children, that a woman alone cannot maintain a farm, that without Samuel I have no hope of success. They promised to return with legal means to claim what I will not sell. I believe them. They have the law on their side, or rather, they have lawyers and judges who will interpret the law to favor white men over a black widow. But I also have the law. Samuel made sure I understood every word of our deed, every clause, every legal protection. He taught me to read not just words, but meanings, implications, loopholes. I will use what he taught me. I will fight." The journal entries from the following weeks documented Ada's preparation for battle. She had traveled to Oklahoma City to consult with attorneys, searching for someone who would take her case. Most had refused, either unwilling to antagonize powerful white business interests or skeptical that a black woman could successfully defend her property rights. But she had found Marcus Webb, a black lawyer who had recently opened his practice after graduating from Howard University's law school. Webb had agreed to represent her without payment, taking the case on principle. "Mr. Webb says our case is strong," Ada wrote in March 1908. "The deed is legitimate, Samuel had no debts, and the claims against us are fabricated. But he also warns me that strong cases and just causes do not always prevail in courtrooms where judges see us as less than human. He advises that we need evidence so clear, so undeniable, that even a hostile court cannot ignore it. He suggests we create a photographic record, a formal image showing our family and the deed itself, proof that we possess the original document and that it belongs to us. I will arrange this. My daughters and I will stand together, and the world will see that we have every right to what is ours." James found a letter tucked between the pages of Ada's journal, dated April 2nd, 1908, written in Ada's careful script and addressed to Marcus Webb. "Mr. Webb," Ada had written, "I'm taking your advice. Tomorrow I will take my daughters to Mr. Harrison's photography studio in Tulsa, and we will create the permanent record you suggested. I will bring the original deed, and we will ensure it is clearly visible in the photograph. Caroline, my eldest, asked me why we must do this, why we cannot simply present the deed in court as other families would. I told her that other families are white, and white families are presumed to tell the truth. We must prove everything, document everything, because our word alone will never be enough. If the courts will not hear our voices, perhaps they will be forced to acknowledge our documented proof, preserved in an image that cannot be altered or destroyed." This was it, the explanation for the photograph's unusual composition. Ada had not been posing for a simple family portrait. She had been creating evidence, a visual record that would prove her family's legitimate ownership of their land in a way that testimony alone never could. James found Marcus Webb's response letter dated April 5th, 1908, written on letterhead from his Oklahoma City law office. "Mrs. Freeman, I received your letter, along with the photograph you commissioned. It is a powerful image, and I believe it will serve our purposes well. I have made 3 copies using Mr. Harrison's facilities, one for our court files, one for my personal records, and one for you to keep in a safe place separate from the original. The deed visible between your daughters is clear enough that any judge would be forced to acknowledge its authenticity and your possession of it. The positioning of your daughters around the document, their protective postures, the dignity in all of your faces, this photograph tells a story that transcends mere legal documentation. It declares your humanity, your rights, and your determination. We will present this in our next hearing. Take heart, Mrs. Freeman. Justice may be slow, but it is not dead." But had justice prevailed? James needed to know the outcome. He turned to the next section of the box, finding a thick folder labeled Court Cases 1908-1931. Inside were transcripts from multiple court proceedings. The first hearing, held in May 1908 at the Tulsa County Courthouse, had ruled against Ada. Judge William Morrison had dismissed her claims and ordered the property seized to settle the legitimate debts of her late husband, debts that Ada insisted were fabricated, supported only by forged promissory notes that had mysteriously appeared after Samuel's death. But Marcus Webb had immediately filed an appeal. James read through the appellate brief, marveling at Webb's methodical dismantling of every claim against the Freeman family. He had challenged the authenticity of the promissory notes, pointing out inconsistencies in dates, signatures, and witnessing. He had presented testimony from handwriting experts who testified that the signatures purporting to be Samuel's were forgeries. He had submitted the photograph as Exhibit C, with accompanying testimony from the photographer confirming the authenticity of the deed visible in the image. The appeals process had taken 3 agonizing years. James read transcript after transcript, watching as Webb fought through procedural obstacles, hostile judges, and witnesses who suddenly changed their testimony under pressure from the development company's attorneys. But in 1911, the Oklahoma Territorial Supreme Court had reversed the lower court's decision. The ruling, written by Justice William Harrison, explicitly referenced the photograph. The court finds that Mrs. Ada Freeman has presented clear and convincing evidence of her family's rightful ownership of the disputed property, Justice Harrison had written. The photographic record submitted as Exhibit C demonstrates beyond dispute that Mrs. Freeman possessed the original deed to said property at the time of these proceedings, and expert testimony confirms the authenticity of said deed. The court further finds that the promissory notes presented by the plaintiff bear unmistakable signs of forgery and cannot be credited as legitimate debt instruments. The lower court's ruling is reversed. The property belongs to Mrs. Ada Freeman and her heirs. The 1911 victory should have been the end of the story, but James discovered that Ada's fight had only just begun. The Tulsa Development Company had not accepted defeat gracefully. Instead, they had launched a new legal strategy, attempting to claim the land through adverse possession, arguing that the property had been abandoned during the years of legal proceedings when Ada had been forced to work in Tulsa to support her family while fighting the court battle. James found Ada's journal entries from this period, and her exhaustion was evident in every line, in the way her usually careful handwriting grew shakier, the ink blotted more frequently with what could only have been tears. "I'm so tired," she wrote in September 1912. "Tired of courts, tired of lawyers, tired of fighting men who have unlimited resources and no conscience. My daughters are growing up in a home filled with legal papers instead of joy, with fear instead of security. My eldest, Caroline, is 17 now and asks me why we don't simply leave, start over somewhere else where we might find peace. How do I explain to her that if we surrender, if we let them steal what Samuel died protecting, then his death meant nothing? How do I make her understand that this is not just about land? This is about whether we have any rights at all in this country, whether the law protects us or only protects them. How do I tell her that running away means teaching her and her sisters that we will always be powerless, always be displaced, always be at the mercy of those who see us as less than human?" But, despite her exhaustion, Ada had not given up. With Marcus Webb's continued assistance, she fought the adverse possession claim with the same meticulous documentation she had brought to the first case. She gathered affidavits from neighbors confirming that she and her daughters had maintained continuous presence on the property. She presented receipts for seeds purchased, crops sold, taxes paid, every scrap of paper that proved ongoing occupation and cultivation. She documented every day she and her daughters had lived on the property, every crop they had planted, every improvement they had made to the house and outbuildings. She gathered testimony from members of the Liberty community, confirming that the Freeman family had never abandoned their land, that they had worked it continuously despite the harassment and threats. The case had gone to trial in 1913. This time, Ada herself had taken the stand to testify, a rare occurrence for a black woman in an Oklahoma courtroom, and one that Marcus Webb had carefully prepared her for. James found a newspaper clipping from the Oklahoma City Black Dispatch that covered the trial in detail. Mrs. Ada Freeman took the stand yesterday in her ongoing battle to retain ownership of her family's homestead in Liberty Township, the article reported. Speaking with quiet dignity that silenced the crowded courtroom, she described how her late husband, Samuel Freeman, had been murdered in 1908 after refusing to sell their property to the Tulsa Development Company. Mrs. Freeman presented photographic evidence, witness testimony, and detailed records proving her family's continuous occupation and cultivation of the disputed land. Her attorney, Mr. Marcus Webb, argued that the development company's claim of abandonment was not only false, but represented a cynical attempt to use the legal system to complete through fraud what they had begun with murder. The courtroom fell into complete silence as Mrs. Freeman concluded her testimony by stating, "This land is watered with my husband's blood and my family's tears. My daughters and I have worked it, planted it, harvested it, and paid taxes on it every single year since my husband's death. We will not surrender it to those who believe our lives and our rights mean nothing. We will stand on this land until the law recognizes what should be obvious to any person of conscience, that we are human beings with the same rights as any other American family." The jury had deliberated for less than 2 hours before ruling in Ada's favor. The adverse possession claim was rejected, and the Freeman family's ownership was reaffirmed for a second time. James discovered that Ada's struggle had been part of a much broader and more systematic pattern of dispossession. Throughout the 1910s and 1920s, black property owners across Oklahoma had faced coordinated attempts to drive them from their land. The methods varied. Legal challenges like those Ada faced, economic pressure through denial of credit and supplies, outright violence, and organized intimidation campaigns. But the goal was always the same: to eliminate black economic independence and force families back into subordinate positions as laborers and sharecroppers rather than landowners. In a box labeled Liberty Township Community Records, James found minutes from meetings of the Liberty Township Landowners Association, a mutual aid organization that Ada had helped found in 1910. The minutes documented strategies for collective protection, families taking turns guarding each other's properties at night, pooling resources to hire attorneys for cases that affected multiple families, maintaining detailed records that could serve as evidence in court, and establishing networks of communication to warn of threats. One entry from June 1914 noted, "Mrs. Ada Freeman reported 3 incidents of fence cutting on her property this month, resulting in the loss of livestock worth approximately $40. Her eldest daughter Caroline observed 2 men on the property late at night, but they fled before identification was possible. The association voted unanimously to establish organized night patrols and to petition the county sheriff for protection, though Mrs. Freeman noted that we hold little hope of his cooperation given his past indifference to our complaints." The sheriff's department had indeed refused to help. James found Ada's formal letter to the governor of Oklahoma, dated July 1914, describing in detailed, careful language the systematic harassment faced by Liberty Township residents and requesting state intervention to protect their constitutional rights to property and personal security. The governor's response, if there had been one, was not in the files, but Ada had found other forms of support and resistance. James discovered extensive correspondence between Ada and various civil rights organizations, including the newly formed NAACP, which had been established in 1909. A letter from NAACP Chairman Moorfield Story, dated March 1915, praised Ada's courageous and principled stand against injustice and promised to bring national attention to the plight of Negro landowners in Oklahoma who are being systematically dispossessed through violence, fraud, and legal manipulation that makes a mockery of constitutional protections. The NAACP had been true to its word. James found newspaper clippings from black newspapers across the country: the Chicago Defender, the New York Age, the Baltimore Afro-American, the Pittsburgh Courier, all featuring stories about Ada Freeman and the broader struggle to maintain black-owned land in Oklahoma. The photograph of Ada and her daughters, with the deed visible between them, had been reprinted in several publications, becoming a powerful symbol of resistance against land theft and a rallying image for property rights activism. Mrs. Ada Freeman's fight is the fight of every Negro family seeking to build a future through honest labor and legal land ownership, one editorial in the Chicago Defender proclaimed. Now, her determination to hold what is rightfully hers, despite murder, fraud, intimidation, and a legal system designed to favor her oppressors, represents the best of our race's spirit of resistance and survival. We must support her cause as if it were our own, because it is. Every acre of land lost by a Negro family through violence or legal theft is an acre lost to all of us, a retreat from the economic independence that is the true foundation of freedom. As James continued through the archives, carefully examining decades of documents, he began to piece together what had happened to Ada's 4 daughters, the girls frozen in that 1908 photograph at a moment of profound grief and determination. What had their lives become? How had growing up in the midst of their mother's legal battles shaped them? He found the answer in Helen Richardson's own extensive writings. Helen, the great-granddaughter who had preserved all these documents with such care, had interviewed her grandmother Caroline extensively during the 1970s, recording hours of conversations and transcribing them meticulously. These transcripts filled an entire box. Grandmother Caroline told me that the day they took that photograph changed her life forever, Helen had written in her introduction to the interviews. She was 16 years old, and she had just watched her father be murdered in front of their home. She wanted to run away, to escape Oklahoma and all the pain and violence it represented, but standing there in the photographer's studio, with the deed to their land positioned carefully between her and her younger sister Joyce, she understood for the first time what her mother was trying to teach them through this seemingly simple act. That photograph wasn't just evidence for a court case, it was a declaration of their humanity and their rights as citizens. It was her mother saying, without words, but with undeniable clarity, "We exist, we own this land legally, and we will not be erased or displaced without a fight. We deserve to be here. We have earned our place." Caroline had gone on to become a teacher, dedicating her life to educating black children in Liberty Township and surrounding communities. She had attended teacher training college in Oklahoma City, one of the first black women from rural Oklahoma to do so, and had returned to Liberty to establish a school that operated for over 30 years. She had married in 1915 to a man named Robert Johnson, and they had 3 children together, all of whom grew up on the Freeman land that Ada had fought so hard to protect. Ada's second daughter, Ruth, had become a nurse, pursuing training at the Freedmen's Hospital in Washington, D.C., and becoming one of the first black registered nurses in Oklahoma. She had worked tirelessly during the influenza epidemic of 1918, treating families throughout Liberty and the surrounding areas when white hospitals refused to admit black patients. She had married a doctor, and together they had established a small clinic in Tulsa's Greenwood district. Ada's third daughter, Esther, had married a farmer and had actually expanded the Freeman property holdings by purchasing adjacent land that white families had abandoned during the agricultural depression of the 1920s. She and her husband had built their home on land adjoining Ada's original property, creating a family compound that eventually housed 3 generations. The youngest daughter, Joyce, one of the girls between whom the deed had been positioned in that crucial photograph, had moved to Tulsa as a young woman and had become a successful businesswoman, opening a seamstress shop that catered to Greenwood's prosperous black middle class. But despite her urban life, she had never sold her share of the family land, returning regularly to help with harvests and maintain the property. Through all the decades that followed, through the Depression that devastated agricultural communities, through World War II that took away young men, including Ada's grandsons, through the Civil Rights era that brought new forms of struggle and resistance, the Freeman family had held onto those 160 acres. They had farmed it, built homes on it, raised children on it, and passed it down through generations as both an economic asset and a symbol of their ancestors' courage. But James noticed something troubling in the carefully organized timeline that Helen had created. The records ended abruptly in 1982 with a stark notation written in red ink. Property dispute filed by Tulsa County Development Authority. Eminent domain proceedings initiated. Must fight this. James looked up at Robert, his stomach tightening with apprehension. What happened in 1982? Robert's expression darkened, and he was quiet for a long moment before responding. That's when Helen's legal career really began, or rather, when it found its true purpose. The county wanted the Freeman land for a highway expansion project. They claimed it was necessary for economic development, for connecting Tulsa to growing suburbs. They offered the family compensation, of course. They had to, under eminent domain law, but it was a fraction of the land's actual value. They assessed it as simple farmland, ignoring its location, its development potential, and certainly ignoring its historical and emotional significance. And Helen fought them, James said, already knowing the answer. Helen had just passed the bar exam that year, Robert replied. She was 32 years old, working at a small firm doing contract law, no experience in property law or constitutional litigation. But she had grown up hearing her grandmother Caroline's stories about Ada's battle, and she had been raised to understand that the Freeman land represented more than economic value. It was a legacy of resistance, a proof that her ancestors had claimed their rights and won against overwhelming opposition. James spent the next 2 days reviewing the legal battle of the 1980s and early 1990s. Reading through the files, he felt an eerie sense of déjà vu. It was Ada's fight all over again, separated by nearly 8 decades, but following disturbingly similar patterns. Different century, different legal justification, different specific tactics, but the same underlying reality. Powerful interests aligned with government authority, trying to take land from a black family through a system that gave them every procedural advantage. Helen Richardson had taken on the case herself, despite her inexperience and despite advice from senior attorneys who told her the fight was unwinnable. Eminent domain cases, they explained, almost always favored the government. The courts gave enormous deference to claims of public necessity, and compensation disputes rarely resulted in significantly higher payments. But Helen had challenged every single aspect of the county's case with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized Ada's resistance 70 years earlier. First, she argued that the proposed highway route was unnecessary, that multiple alternative routes existed that would not require taking the Freeman property. She hired civil engineers and traffic consultants who testified that the alternative routes were actually more practical from an engineering standpoint and less expensive to construct. She presented studies showing that the county's stated justification for the specific route, that it provided optimal traffic flow, was contradicted by their own traffic data. Second, she documented that Tulsa County had a disturbing history of using eminent domain disproportionately against black landowners, establishing a pattern that suggested racial discrimination rather than neutral public policy. She spent months in county archives, reviewing every eminent domain case filed in the previous 30 years. Her research revealed that while black families represented only 15% of landowners in Tulsa County, they had been subject to 67% of eminent domain takings during that period. Third, she challenged the county's valuation of the property, arguing that they had deliberately and systematically underestimated its worth. She brought in independent appraisers who valued the land at more than 3 times the county's offer, accounting for its location near developing suburbs, its potential for residential or commercial development, and comparable sales in the area. The legal battle had dragged through multiple courts, appeals, and retrials over 9 exhausting years. James found transcripts showing Helen's arguments becoming more sophisticated and more powerful with each hearing, her understanding of property law and constitutional rights deepening through sheer determination and endless hours of research. In a 1987 appellate brief that James found particularly moving, Helen had written, "This is not merely a case about fair compensation for property taken for public use. This is a case about whether the descendants of enslaved people who fought for a century to claim and keep their land against violence, fraud, and systematic legal oppression will be stripped of that land by the same governmental systems that once sanctioned their enslavement and later turned a blind eye to their dispossession. My great-great-grandmother, Ada Freeman, held this land through murder, fraud, and intimidation. She won in court in 1911 and again in 1913 because the law, however reluctantly, eventually recognized her rights as a human being and a citizen. I ask this court, has the law changed? Do we still have those rights? Or were they always provisional, always subject to revocation whenever our land becomes convenient for others to take?" The Oklahoma Supreme Court had ruled in Helen's favor in 1991 in a decision that James read with tears streaming down his face. The court found that Tulsa County had failed to prove the necessity of the specific route through the Freeman property, that alternative routes were indeed viable and potentially superior, and that the county's valuation methodology had been flawed and potentially discriminatory. The government's power of eminent domain is not unlimited, Justice Patricia Martinez had written in the majority opinion. It must be exercised with scrupulous attention to both constitutional requirements and basic fairness. When a family has maintained ownership of property for a century, surviving every attempt to dispossess them through violence and legal manipulation, and when that property represents not merely economic value but historical significance and family legacy, the government's burden to prove genuine public necessity is particularly heavy. The county has not met that burden here. Oh, the Freeman family kept their land? James closed the last box of documents and sat in silence in Robert's conference room, overwhelmed by the century-long story he had uncovered. From Ada's first hopeful journal entry in 1891 to Helen's final court victory exactly 100 years later, the Freeman family had fought continuously, across 4 generations, to maintain their claim to 160 acres of Oklahoma land. "What happened to the property after Helen won?" James asked Robert quietly. "She donated most of it to a land trust," Robert replied, his voice thick with emotion. "The Helen Richardson Freeman Land Preservation Trust. She established it with ironclad legal protections, ensuring that the property can never be sold or taken through eminent domain. It's currently operated as a heritage site and educational center, teaching people about black land ownership, the all-black towns of Oklahoma, and the legal battles families like the Freemans fought across generations." "And the original deed? The one from the photograph?" Robert smiled and opened a locked drawer in his desk, pulling out a protective archival sleeve containing an old, carefully preserved document. Helen kept it safe for over 70 years after her grandmother Caroline gave it to her. She donated it to the Smithsonian just before she died, along with the photograph and all the family papers you've been reading. She wanted the full story preserved together, available to researchers and the public, so that what Ada and her daughters fought for would never be forgotten. James held the deed carefully through its protective sleeve, looking at the same document that had been positioned between 2 young girls in 1908, a talisman of hope and proof of rights in a world designed to deny both. The paper was fragile now, browned with age, but the words were still clear, written in formal legal script. "Ada Freeman, landowner, 160 acres, Liberty Township, Oklahoma Territory." 2 months later, James stood in the new exhibition hall at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, watching as visitors encountered the story he had helped bring to light. The centerpiece of the Claiming the Land, Black Property Rights and Resistance exhibition was the 1908 photograph of Ada and her daughters, enlarged to cover an entire wall. Next to it, in a climate-controlled display case with carefully calibrated lighting to prevent further deterioration, was the original deed. Visitors moved through the exhibition, reading Ada's journal entries, examining court documents, learning about the systematic efforts to dispossess black landowners, and the equally systematic resistance those families mounted. Interactive displays showed maps of Oklahoma's all-black towns, more than 50 communities established between 1865 and 1920, most of them now gone, destroyed, or abandoned under pressure from white supremacist violence and legal manipulation. But Liberty still existed, transformed now into the Freeman Heritage Site, where school groups came to learn about this history, where descendants of the original families gathered for annual celebrations, where the land itself served as a living testament to the power of perseverance and the importance of documented rights. James watched as a young black girl, perhaps 10 years old, stood transfixed before the photograph of Ada and her daughters. She studied the image intently, her eyes moving from face to face before focusing on the document positioned between the two youngest girls. Finally, she turned to her mother with a question. "Why are they holding the paper like that? Why is it between the girls?" Her mother knelt beside her daughter, pointing at different elements of the photograph. That paper proved the land was theirs. It was called a deed, and it meant they owned the property legally. They were making sure everyone could see it in the photograph, so no one could say later that it didn't exist or wasn't real. It was like evidence, like proof that couldn't be argued with. The girl nodded slowly, her expression serious beyond her years. "They look strong," she said finally, her finger tracing the outline of Ada's face on the wall. "They were incredibly strong," her mother agreed, her own voice breaking slightly. "And because they were strong, because they fought and never gave up, even when terrible things happened, we can be here today, learning their story. That land they fought for, it's still there, still in the family, still teaching people about courage and rights and never surrendering what's yours." James felt tears prickling his eyes as he watched this exchange, understanding in that moment why the work of historical preservation mattered so profoundly. This was why uncovering these stories, documenting these forgotten battles, bringing these acts of courage and resistance into public memory, this was why it all mattered. The photograph that Helen Richardson had so carefully preserved and donated, the photograph that had seemed like just another historical image when James first examined it months ago, had revealed itself to be something far more significant. A deliberate act of documentation by a grieving widow who understood that in a racist legal system, visual evidence might be her only weapon. It was a strategic use of emerging photographic technology to create proof that courts could not easily dismiss. It was a testament to one family's absolute refusal to surrender what was rightfully theirs, no matter the cost. Ada Freeman had died in 1943 at the age of 78, still living on the land she and Samuel had claimed in 1891. She had seen her daughters grow into accomplished, principled women. She had held her grandchildren, born as free people on land their family owned. She had seen her family's rights affirmed repeatedly in courts of law, and she had known before she died that the photograph she had commissioned in 1908 had done exactly what she intended it to do. It had preserved the truth. It had provided evidence. It had ensured that her family's story and their rights would endure. 160 acres, one deed. 4 daughters who became teachers, nurses, farmers, and businesswomen. One determined mother who understood that documentation could be resistance, and a photograph that held them all together across more than a century, still teaching, still testifying, still declaring with quiet but unmistakable power, we were here, we had rights, we fought with every tool available to us, and we won. The land remained, the legacy remained. The story, finally told, would remain as well.